Mr. Gustafson, please bring forth your first witness. Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it is my privilege to be here before you today to present my client for your consideration. We will be focusing on one aspect of my client so that you can see with your own eyes the merits and flaws of my character so that you can determine for yourself if you would also like to consider my client for your own interests. My client will serve as the first witness. If you prefer, a witness of character. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Character Witness. I, of course, am Rob, your favorite character lawyer, and I am here to present a slightly different format. You see, we're not going to create a character within this Character Witness, but I thought it was useful if instead I explained some of the details that I glossed over in earlier character witnesses. I know some people were confused by the methods that I used to create the characters, using styles that simply don't fit with the way that a lot of modern games end up going. And I thought it would be useful to talk about that. A lot of these differences are a direct relation to how games have adapted and developed. There are certain structures that are in place that simply weren't existent back in the earlier days of gaming. And a lot of talk about old school style games highlight these differences. In this case, I'm going to be using what's considered the basic Dungeons & Dragons, or BECMI, in the body of the Dungeons & Dragons Rules Cyclopedia to highlight these differences for you. Now, we all generally have an idea of what role-playing is. However, that is a term that has evolved in meaning from the days of antiquity to the current day. This transition was relatively fast-paced, considering that the entirety of the role-playing hobby is 50 years old. But in general, it was originally understood that role-playing meant a particular thing, and today's role-play means something a little bit different. Role-playing today is you have a character. You play your character. You can talk as your character. You decide the actions of your character. You roll dice to see what your character can do. However, role has another meaning as well. Earlier on, role-playing meant you had a job within the general group, and that the party's success and failure depended on people performing their roles adequately. And the differences in those roles either served to address a particular need for the group, or it served to circumvent certain challenges that the group otherwise would be slowed down, injured, or killed by. Now, with a successful balance of these roles within a group, you had a much stronger group, not having to worry quite as much about certain challenges that a group that was less balanced might be stymied by. And by looking at the different classes, many of which we, again, kind of glossed over by the needs of the characters that I rolled during previous character witnesses, it is useful in current parlance to understand the differences in these roles and use these to move forward in our understanding with how these games used to look and present these characters for the players. Now, of course, the cornerstone of many of these games and the groups that would play within them would be the fighter. You are looking at the classic heavy armor, often with a shield or a two-handed weapon, and lots of hit points. The best abilities to strike their foes. These were the characters that would stand in the front line of a group and take on the most powerful monsters, buying the rest of the group time to either strike the monster from advantageous positions, or in some cases to run away and slow down the advances of the monster so that the group could survive. Now, fighters have always been a central part in the role of fantasy gaming, and quite often in other genres there is some style that is designed to be a solid rock that the rest of the group can flow around. The term for this that has kind of come out of video gaming is the tank, and it is appropriate. By being less concerned with mobility and more concerned with being hard to damage, and if you damage that person, them having a large reservoir of endurance, you have a person who is ideal for bottling up enemies, fighting foes to a standstill so that the rest of the group can maximize their abilities. Fighters have certain advantages, but those advantages are relatively confined in the earliest days of gaming. They fit the most from a transition from wargaming, wherein they have a high armor class, or back in the day that was a low armor class, they had a descending scale, but they were more difficult to hit as your typical fighter because they were going to absorb the lion's share of the punishment. Most of the blows against the enemy parties were, if you were successful, going to be against the heavier armor of your fighter. That fighter has to be a fearless character, able to interpose themselves between the big threats and those who are less equipped to deal with those threats. As a result, better armor was something that a fighter would certainly gravitate towards, as well as other ways of preventing themselves from dying in the course of their actions. As they improved, they were able to absorb more and more punishment. So, as they got better and better at their job, their tanking skills got better and better. Interesting to note also is that they were able to use all weapons. So, in the use of their weapons, they were able to take advantage of certain pairings or be able to leave behind certain disadvantageous weapons in the performance of their jobs. If there's an enemy, for example, that is resistant to cutting weapons, then pulling out the blunt weapon, like a mace, would be the standard part of an adventurer's job as a fighter. However, some games didn't really use the benefits and drawbacks of particular weapons, so a fighter would mostly be worried about getting the most damaging weapon for the particular style that they fought. Perhaps the most magical weapon, or in the case of, if you're early on in the game and you don't have any magical weapons, once you can afford a weapon that does the most damage, for instance, that would be the one you would settle on. For a two-handed sword, for instance, great amount of damage. Depending on the game, if there were no other drawbacks to it, that might be the weapon that you stick with until you find something magical to replace it with. Fighters were also often interested in magical items that would enhance their abilities. Of course, weapons and armor, but also things like potions. Healing potions for a fighter were oftentimes like candy. As many as you can, and use them as often as you can, especially if your group had limited healing opportunities. Understanding the role of a fighter is a crucial part of a party's success or failure. If your fighters decide to dance around and not protect the others in the group, well, unless circumstances were very special in your group, for example, if you had an abundance of other fighters and you had the liberty for your fighter to engage multiple opponents in a variety of places on the battlefield, well, those lesser lights were going to fall, and the fighter would not be able to hold those threats away from them. That being said, there were some variant fighters that were available. You had your ranged fighter, somebody who specialized more with a bow. However, many of these fighters would choose that profession either because they weren't very lucky with the hit points, so they wanted to stay out of direct conflict, or because rolling in the style that we did oftentimes would leave you with scores that might not have been perfectly suited for the particular way that you wanted to play. So if you, for example, rolled an average strength, but you rolled a high dexterity, you might be tempted to look into something that would maximize the effectiveness of your dexterity. That being, quite often, ranged weaponry. So, Outside of that, though, fighters were about personality. If you weren't just playing a playing piece to move throughout the board, and you were interested in giving your character personality, you could be anything. There are a huge list of examples of different types of character personalities that fighters exemplified. The noble knight, the mercenary, the determined archer. You had fantasy characters like Conan, Sinbad, just a vast number. The Knights of the Round Table. To pattern yourself after, or you could go after something that more unique yourself. A lot of times, though, it was that central role of being a fighter that was crucial for a group's success. And if your fighter was doing a good job, everybody else's job got easier. They are considered to be one of the cornerstones of a solid adventuring group, and most groups have at least one core fighter for the rest of the group to fall behind. Now, of course, the other tent peg that almost everybody centralizes around somehow is someone who can solve a variety of problems, including the problems of mass packs of enemies that would take the fighter a long time to deal with, exposing them longer and longer for dangerous situations, which is, of course, the role of the wizard or magic user to deal with. Now, the magic user had more flexibility than most of the other classes. The spells that they actually ended up having access to determined their role in the group. It is hard to pigeonhole wizards into one set or another unless your magic user is a specialist from first or second edition Dungeons and Dragons Advanced. Those specialists could be more easily pigeonholed because they were good at a particular school and then would, repeatedly cast the spells from that school if they were being effective. An Invoker, for instance, is somebody who will quickly help you clear through enemies. They specialize in damage-dealing effects. Your fireballs, your magic missiles, those are the meat and drink of the Invoker. But there's a lot of wiggle room with the other specialists. An enchanter, for instance, might be able to eliminate foes by ensorceling them and possibly adding to the strength of your own group by taking your enemies away from the side that you are fighting and using them as allies for the short term. A conjurer would be able to change the battlefield by littering it with allied creatures that would bedevil your opponents. Not always the most effective creatures in a fight, but ones that quite honestly made your enemy's job more difficult by having all of these nuisance monsters, and sometimes some fairly effective ones, that were fighting against them at the same time that your characters were fighting. Illusionists, if played cleverly, could bedevil opponents in a fight, but oftentimes could do a number of things over a wide, diverse area of impact. You could use them in a social setting, for instance, to disguise the group, or create. The opportunities are practically limitless to a clever player of an illusionist. But the greatest advantage that magic users had was flexibility. The ability to, if you know a challenge is coming up, to load up on the kind of spells and effects that would help the group, in some cases making some challenges trivial. If you wanted to go in and encounter underwater, for instance, if the wizard was, forward-thinking and learned the spell water breathing, the water might be absolutely no difficulty at all for the group. Just go into the water and solve the dungeon as they would. This is an example of an effective magic user doing the most basic function. Again, example of a packed group of foes that would take the fighter a great deal of time to hack through. A single fireball might take care of the entire issue all at once. Magic users were difficult to keep alive. They had a lot of disadvantages to their survival. Low number of hit points, no armor that they're allowed to wear outside of magical protections they can make for themselves, and eventually magical items to protect them. However, if you could keep your magic user alive and gaining experience through the various challenges, your magic user eventually became one of the most valuable members of your group. Even outside of a combat experience, they had access to unique skills and outlooks which could be beneficial to a game of a particular bent. Dealing with supernatural horrors from across the stars, your magic user has a decent chance to have access to the kind of skills and knowledges on how to fight those monsters most effectively, understanding their weaknesses and their actual intentions, which may help to battle effectively. If your magic user was the type of person who did not want to draw a great deal of attention to themselves, there were a number of options. You could buff members of your group, making them more of a target, for instance. I always love the enlarge person spell for that purpose. But also the ability to enchant their weapons temporarily to help them be more potent in a battle. The ability to, in later editions of Dungeons & Dragons, there were enhancement spells, Cat's Grace, Bear's Endurance, things like that, that makes the group better without making you stand out like a beacon to be eliminated. There were, for a particularly shy mage or somebody who enjoyed knowing things, there were the Divination Spells, which enabled you to gather information, which was invaluable in the right kind of adventure. Imagine a murder mystery where you have an effective diviner. Things suddenly become a lot easier, especially if they have customized spells that really help to uncover clues and see things from different perspectives. There were a number of very useful things that magic users could do, and the investment in them was often very worthwhile. On the other hand, it was very difficult to keep them alive in your average dungeon setting. If a blast of breath weapon came through and hit the entire group, the mage was probably the least likely to walk away from it, and you had to think. It was extremely important to outthink the challenges and expose your magic user to as little risk as possible. If you are the kind of player who is rash, impulsive, and doesn't like to think very much, a magic user probably was not optimal for you, even if you fell in love with the idea of fireballs and lightning bolts and disintegrations and things like that. So magic users are something that I enjoy playing tremendously, but they're not for everyone. If the dice determine that it's the optimal class, then, well, it's the one that I would go to without thought. But if you're the kind of person who doesn't like that kind of game style, more cerebral and one who has to spend time not just worrying about the propensities of your character and playing well, but also to have the right set of abilities and skills so that you can take on those challenges, well, back in the day was a bit more demanding. So, when I'm creating a character for those purposes, that's part of the reason why I turn to mages and make the selections that I do. It is important to address that there are challenges to being a magic user, and a poorly prepared magic user is probably not one that's going to live for very long. In addition to that, one other final thing that I think it's important to remember is my general system of determining what character to play based on how I roll. Magic users have the singular most important function of their character class in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and 2nd Edition Dungeons & Dragons. That intelligence score of theirs is totally going to change how effective your magic user is going to be for the entirety of their career. If you have a low prime attribute in any other class, there are workarounds for it. Low strength as a fighter? Well, perhaps you can do well as an archer. You're still going to increase your ability to hit foes faster than anyone else, and you could always get lucky with the hit points and be able to absorb more. Your gear is going to have as much of an impact as your actual physical strength, so if you rolled terribly for everything else, you can always be a fighter. Get some armor, get a weapon, and even if you're not going to hit as hard, you can still stand there and let the other members of the group do what they do well, while you pick up the slack and help out where you can. And who knows, down the road you might find those gauntlets of ogre power or a girdle of giant strength, and all of a sudden the tables are turned. You are a beast on the battlefield once more. A magic user, however, with a low intelligence is going to find themselves crippled. In advanced and 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons, you're not going to be able to get access to those most powerful levels of spells. And while in the short game that might not have a great deal of impact. For example, the character that I just made in the 2nd edition, Elic, didn't have a 16, 17, 18 intelligence. He would never be able to cast spells greater than 7th level. Back in the day, you really weren't playing as much for the epic game, though. And if you could get access to 7th level spells, you were still impressive. Far and away, blowing away the effect of a fighter of equivalent level in just the sheer amount that you can do. So the fact that you are not vastly superior, you can still make an effective character as a mage with just that ability. And if you have low stats and everything else except for that intelligence, you're not unduly crippled. Low strength, nobody expects you to carry your share of the burden, and you can't wear armor or have a lot of weapons anyhow. Low dexterity, well, you better hope the rest of the group can hold the enemies at bay. It's nice to have, but not essential. You have spells that'll eventually mean that if you think things out, your opponents won't be able to strike at you anyhow, so the lower dexterity won't cripple you. Low constitution, you are never going to have a great deal of hit points anyhow. This is just more confirmation of that fact. Every character enjoys having a higher constitution. With mages, it's only doubling down on weakness that you were never going to get away from anyhow. A low wisdom? Well, good time to break out the feeble-minded wizard who potters through life. Having a lot of common sense is not required to be very smart. That's certainly a trope that's been followed many a time. And low charisma? Well, how to win friends and influence people, charm person, or variety of effects that can make up for a low charisma. Obviously it's nice to have, but not essential. And hopefully there's somebody else in the group who can do the talking for you. So, in effect, that is why I would stand by my position that if you have one high attribute, the magic user is the obvious choice. Following up closely, our next person that we're going to talk about, the thief. Thieves, or as they're now called, rogues, they were a subset of the rogue class group in 2nd edition, but they were always called thieves before 3rd edition rolled around. Now, your thief is somebody who is there to fix a particular task. They didn't even exist in 0 edition D&D. They were an add-on class, I believe, with the Blackmoor expansion. And they served to fulfill a particular role. In the earliest versions of Dungeons & Dragons, it was, again, fairly closely patterned on the wargames. So you had the monsters, the fighters would take on the monsters, the magic user would take on large groups of monsters or solve other problems, and your priests, or clerics, which we have not gotten to yet, would serve to heal the group, to buff them up, to make them more powerful, and to debuff your enemies while serving as backup fighters. Your thief is kind of not a perfect match into that group, but they're still one of the pillars of the balance of a group, because they solve all of those other things that can't just be attacked and smitten, or a spell cast to make it go away. Granted, there are some spells down the road that can make up for not having an effective thief, and since many of those magical spells don't have a chance of failure, in some cases they can be more useful than having a thief. But if somebody is playing a thief, they're there with the acknowledgement that there are some things that are handy to have a way to bypass to make your group more effective or make some obstacles just easier to get by. For instance, traps are a constant bedevilment to some groups. Some game masters and dungeon masters really enjoy using traps to either make their players think or to provide extra challenges, possibly adding extra damage and wearing down the group a little bit faster. The threat of traps make the players be a bit more cautious, and they let the thief crack their knuckles and fulfill their role. Some traps are fairly obvious, and then it's time to send the thief up, like a presence of a treasure chest or a door. Many traps cluster around these items, so thieves get professionally paranoid in those circumstances. But Are thieves completely necessary? For some game masters, that's not the case. Some prefer not to use traps or have traps that can be dealt with by outthinking them, more so than just rolling dice to make them go away. An interesting thing is that the presence of the thief brings us a little bit closer to the modern style of gaming where dice are rolled to simulate more things. What you know and what you don't know, how you interact with people. Before thieves existed, you just say what your character tries to do, and the Dungeon Master decides if it has a chance of working and if it truly does work. Maybe there are dice that are rolled to determine if it does work or doesn't work. That's something that many game masters and have house ruled in, or just kind of roll dice to see what happens. With a thief, you have a clear pass-fail situation. They succeed at their roll, which starts out tiny and then eventually grows higher and higher as they get experience, to the point where eventually some things almost become trivial again for the skilled thief. This allows them to see a challenge, roll dice, and take care of it. Something like combat, but without as much of the drama. Some game masters don't like traps. That takes away one of the roles, the jobs of a thief, if there really aren't a lot of traps in existence. But thieves have a lot of other uses too. Climbing, for instance. A thief that can climb up walls is nice, and that's actually one of the better skills that thieves have, even at low levels. A thief who brings a rope with them can help the entire group to bypass challenges where elevation is a chore. The ability to read languages gives them something that most wizards can't do unless they cast a spell, to be able to read and decipher just about anything they come across. The ability to detect noises helps them in a pre-combat setting to avoid ambushes, or possibly to overhear whispered words across the room. This gives them social skills, as well as the ability to help out and prepare the group in advance of combats. As far as opening doors, doors are generally a temporary obstacle. A determined party can get through just about any door, whether that means chopping it down with the fighter's axe or magically blasting it apart. But if a thief can move up and quietly pick a lock, number one, there's no obvious evidence that the party has been through there, which may save them some bedevilment. Secondly, it may allow them to surprise the people on the other side of the door. This also may save them a lot of time, encounters with wandering monsters, and so on. So there are a number of built-in advantages to having a good thief. Some would say they're not truly important, or important enough to be considered as one of the 4 pillars of the game. But there's a clear need, and that is addressed by this class that was added in. As far as combat, the thing that is the majority of the rules in the game, the thief is not a great contributor in the earliest editions of the game. They don't hit quite as well as fighters, and they can't take a lot of punishment. They don't wear very good armor, so they really have no option other than just being strikers, maybe fighters of last resort, but they generally should never be frontline combatants unless you have a very unique dynamic in your group. The ability to backstab, however, again, exemplifies the kind of spot duty that thieves have, the ability to be dramatically effective in small doses in their own particular niche. After they've backstabbed and the opponents know they're there, their opportunities for inflicting great amounts of damage have been used up. A timely backstab in the right place may turn the tide in battle. A thief who misses with his backstab, announcing his presence, or hits and does not strike down their opponent, well, all of a sudden they become, again, a very poor fighter. So thieves are not, again, for the weak of heart. They are also kind of situational. Most groups don't need more than one thief. So if somebody already has a thief, you're probably not going to want to roll up another one. Although, again, this is subjective to your group. It never hurts to have multiple fighters, for instance, but having multiple thieves may feel redundant. However, there are some groups that really do make that work, so your mileage may vary just like anything. But the Thief is a very interesting character in how the dynamic has kind of changed the focus of the game a bit, introduced an entirely new set of mechanics with the Thieves skills that basically opened the door eventually to what 3rd edition will become, with a whole skills-based system that the Thief Rogue utterly dominates with their choice of skill selection, so that they can become vastly experienced in a wide variety of different skills to help the group out or to help themselves out. Let's face it, not all thieves are interested in helping out the group as much. Then you have what another subset of people consider to be the cornerstone of a solid adventuring party, and that is the Cleric. Do I have a picture of a Cleric in here? Yes. The Cleric. My very first character in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was a Cleric. And quite often, early in the day, players were shoehorned into playing clerics. They were seen as essential, because you knew that your characters were going to get beaten up. Going into a dungeon and coming out unscathed is something nearly unheard of, and many game masters think that if the players don't know they've been in a fight, well, they won't remember the encounter, and they know how they've been in a fight by how many hit points they've had taken off. This may be an unfair point of view, but even so, it's almost inevitable. If you go into a situation where there is the risk of combat, especially repeated combats over time, then the ability to overcome the inevitable effects of these combats becomes quite clear. Successful groups are going to have some way of mitigating or rapidly healing from the kind of injuries that combat can bring forward. Enter the Cleric. Now, clerics, of course, in earlier games have access to all the weapons and all the armor that can make them effective. They may have restrictions on the weapons they can use. Basic Edition and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons First Edition had the inability to use sharpened or edged weapons. And that was a restriction that really didn't crushingly hurt the Cleric, as there were effective weapons that were blunt, maces and so on, that they could use. But the ability to wear any kind of armor also led them to be quite effective secondary fighters. Not doing quite as much damage as fighters in hand-to-hand combat, and not being able to take as much punishment. They had a reduced hit die than the fighter did, but again, in a pinch, or perhaps by default in the beginning of a battle, moving up to take their place alongside of the fighters on the front line. Certainly they were better prepared for combat than thieves or magic users. And clerics, again, I have a soft spot for clerics. They can be fairly effective with just a fairly basic wisdom score, and still be able to, cast effectively. However, to truly be effective in any of the other roles, in terms of, say, combat, having some constitution so they can absorb some punishment, or a higher strength so that they can deliver some punishment in melee, well, you suddenly have a much more effective cleric, quite honestly. But it's the intelligence that you play the class with that really is going to determine if your cleric is successful or not. If you pick out good spells that can support your group and not just load up on Cure Light Wound spells, well, some of that curing may be obviated by a timely buff that avoids the damage that you otherwise would have taken, allowing you to take out your enemies faster. Reducing the exposure of your group to risk is a preemptive way of healing them. And a good cleric makes everybody else's job easier, much like a good fighter does. Clerics are support characters. They are there to back up and amplify what other characters do. So a cleric, to be able to play them well, you have to understand what your other characters are trying to do. Obviously, you're not going to have quite as much of a benefit to, say, the thief, unless you consider the silent spell and making it so they never have to make a move silently roll. Or perhaps the wizard. Well, if you can cast a circle of protection that will protect the wizard, you can make sure that they can continue casting their spells effectively too. And of course, anything that can aid prayer or buff your fighters is a good thing. This, of course, means that your cleric has access to a wide range of skills and abilities, and choosing which one is going to be the most effective to you is oftentimes the key to being a good cleric. But here's the thing, and this is, I think, most essential. As Dungeons & Dragons moved on and evolved, the role of the cleric had to evolve. When I first started playing and I was given a cleric to start out with, my first thought was, cool. Later on down the road, I understood my character's role was a healing battery. I was to trot along with the group, take care of their injuries in the pinch of a fight, and very much like a battlefield medic, move up into danger, exposing myself to risk to stop the fighters from dying. Then pulling back, doing whatever else that I could. Sometimes I'd be able to cast a spiritual hammer spell and attack foes a bit, but I was mostly effective when I was taking care of the rest of the group. And some people, that's really galling. Now, the character class changes and evolves. They do keep most of their core abilities, but some of the flavor and the style of the characters changes over that time. Especially in 2nd edition, when spheres come out and characters now can no longer access all of the spells, so those spells that they get tightly define their characters and their roles. Some of them become strikers, for instance, less so than healers. Or some of them eventually get spells that make them similar to magic users and bedeviling their opponents or filling in a particular niche without the flexibility of being able to do everything. Some of them are extremely good as controllers, and some were enchanters as well. So clerics really do get a lot of love as far as the evolution department goes. They, with every new edition, get new things that they can do, new aspects that they can explore, which is important because clerics are a role that probably more than any of the other except for the fighter kind of typifies the important pillar that the rest of the group needs to stand upon. Without that kind of access to healing and buffing and things, the rest of the group is really going to have to struggle to have the kind of recoverability and spot magic to cover up circumstances that will arise as the game goes on. Understanding these particular roles is fairly important to understanding the earlier approaches to gaming. And sometimes if you were in a vacuum and you didn't know what the other players in your group were going to do, you just kind of had to let the dice determine what you were going to choose to be. In the earliest editions, that was just the way to play. You rolled the dice and randomly saw what you were going to get. Later on, where you were able to move scores around, because different rolling styles allowed you to do that, you had a much greater bit of control over what your character was going to eventually end up looking like. Because of that style of games, that's why I chose the particular rolling methods that I did for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and 2nd Edition Dungeons & Dragons. It was because I wanted to stay as true to the style of play as I remember being. Of course, even during the time that I was playing 2nd Edition back in college and beyond, I also got to playing and adjusting character attributes and things so that I could play different classes. That was just a part of the game, especially when you were considering what other people were playing around you. But in a vacuum, just letting the dice see what you end up with is one of the kind of exciting things for a certain mindset. Not knowing, but having infinite potential in front of you with the dice telling you what your character can eventually be. Some people hate that, and I understand that. Some people think that, they come into character creation in their mind knowing what they want. And if they use dice to determine their characteristics, sometimes the dice won't be kind to you. Sometimes you have mechanisms in place where you can mitigate the dice not being as obliging, but back in the day, that's just the hand we were dealt, and we would play on through that. So Knowing the different roles that were available is something that was essential skills that a player had to learn. And groups eventually had to learn. There was a feeling in process every time you'd start up a new group, figuring out who did what roles. The fighters would generally navigate to the front of the fight. That was their understood role, and it was an easy one to grasp. That's why so many new players start out as fighters. The rest of the group would be diversified according to their particular wants and peculiarities. And you would eventually learn what the other characters were going to do just by your association and repeated experiences. But those particular roles, the cleric, the healer, the supporter, the fighter, the front line, the tank, the wizard, the whatever your wizard was going to evolve into, and the thief, the person who took care of all of the different special circumstances that you would have to struggle against, those were things that you learned, those were things that you adapted, and those were things that you ultimately mastered through the course of gameplay. So that's something that I don't touch on as much in my character witnesses, but I thought it was important to discuss it, and of course possibly engender some discussion. So if you wish to comment about this, feel free in the comments below. I will respond to anything that you would say. And I hope you've enjoyed this treatise on the roles of early Dungeons & Dragons. Bear in mind, too, that these roles are something that are repeated in many other role-playing games, especially the retro clones that have come out since, like Labyrinth Lord and Swords and Sorcery. So, again, to master those kind of games, knowing this topic is not a bad thing. So, I'm Rob, once more here in the law offices of Gustafson and Gustafson, and I thank you for joining me. Until next time, farewell, and may you always be treated justly in the court of character law.